The city of Hobart, capital of Tasmania, an island at the bottom of the world. Today, Hobart is a bustling modern city and busy port. But it was only 200 years ago that Tasmania was a British colony known as Diemens Land, and so remote that its only use was as a penal settlement for the most hardened criminals. Times have definitely changed, yet that remote, untamed island of history is never far away. Mount Wellington rises straight out of the city to more than 1,200 meters. It's possible, in just a little over half an hour, to drive from a city centre restaurant to a wilderness where you could freeze to death. Even in summer, snow can fall here. To the people of Hobart, this place is simply the mountain, a finger of a vast and trackless wilderness pointing right at the heart of the city. So it's not surprising that Tasmania's wild heritage plays a central role in the lives of the island's human inhabitants. Tasmania is part of Australia, but it's also a world apart. It's the size of Ireland, yet less than 500,000 people live here. So vast areas are still wilderness. The western half of the island is more mountainous and catches the prevailing winds, so is wetter. Here there are hidden valleys filled with a tangle of cool, temperate rainforests, ancient trees and tree ferns. On the mountain slopes, forests of twisted snow gums. On the mountain plateaus, endless stretches of button grass moorland. At the heart of this wilderness is Cradle Mountain. Back in 1909, an Austrian immigrant called Gustav Weindorfer came to explore these mountains, which reminded him so much of the Alps of his childhood that he never left. He was one of the first to really appreciate the value of Tasmania's natural spectacles and to encourage their preservation, so that others might also benefit from encounters with wild nature. He built a rambling wooden house here, which he called Waldheim, forest home, and into the wall he carved, "This is Waldheim, where there is no time and nothing matters." The same could still be said about much of Tasmania. And today there are modern Weindorfers right across this green land, all dedicated to preserving Tasmania's unique nature and helping visitors to appreciate it. On the remote northwest coast, Jeff King, a fifth-generation native, gave up cattle farming to create a place where people can meet wild Tasmanian devils. Right on the edge of the great southwestern wilderness, Ray Green has set up a sanctuary for Tasmania's unique and threatened creatures. In the northeast, Craig Williams is a bushman, at home in the forests of giant gum trees. And on the southeast coast, biologist Tonya Cochrane runs a company that specializes in showing people Tasmania's extraordinary natural wealth. She knows places that can transport you back in time to a more ancient Australia.
We're now in a cool temperate rainforest, and this is what they thought that the original forest used to be like in Australia a couple of 100 million years ago, when Australia was part of a supercontinent called Gondwana.
Gondwana was made up of Africa, South America, Antarctica, New Zealand and Australia. And as it broke up, each region carried away its own cargo of plants and animals from that ancient supercontinent. Many of the trees in these modern rainforests still bear the mark of Gondwana, if you know what you're looking for.
One of the fascinating ones is this guy here. It's called the Antarctic beech or myrtle, and it's one of our Gondwana relics. There's 3 in Australia, 4 in South America, 4 in New Zealand. So all the Gondwana countries got representatives of these, and they go back to a common ancestor which supposedly came from what we know as Antarctica these days.
Many places in Tasmania look and feel primordial, but none more so than the forests of giant tree ferns that seem to come from the age of dinosaurs. There may be no dinosaurs here now, but there are creatures with an even more ancient heritage: mountain shrimps. Fossils virtually identical to these little crustaceans date back more than 250 million years. It too is a relic of more ancient times. Its nearest relatives, like the trees above, live on other fragments of Gondwana, in South America and New Zealand. After Gondwana broke apart, Tasmania was joined to the rest of Australia. But at the end of the last ice age, the land bridge was flooded by rising sea levels, and Tasmania was cut off. But there was plenty of time before it was cast adrift for many of Australia's familiar animals to simply hop aboard. Grey kangaroos. So common in some areas that they crop the turf as closely as the best bowling green. And they fertilise the grass too. Kangaroos are such good gardeners that these areas are called marsupial lawns. But, cut off on Tasmania, grey kangaroos continued to evolve in isolation. They are now different enough from their mainland relatives that they've been given their own name: Forester kangaroos. Red-necked wallabies are also common here, helping the kangaroos to maintain the lawns. And they too are now different to their mainland relatives. On Tasmania, red-necked wallabies are called Bennett's wallabies. Australia is known as the island continent, so Tasmania is an island off an island, and so, to the locals, Bruny Island, off Tasmania's southeast coast, is an island off an island off an island. And with such extreme isolation, natural selection has further changed the local wallabies. But to see its effects, you don't have to search a remote wilderness. The best place to look is the local caravan park. Bennett's wallabies come here for free handouts, so they become very tame. And it's easy to spot that they're very different to those on mainland Tasmania.
Hello, how are you? Hello. One of the amazing things on Bruny Island is this population of nearly white wallabies. They're almost albino. They've got pink eyes, but they've got a little bit of pigment around their necks. It's normally a very rare colour form, a mutation, and normally the baby ones get eaten by predators very early on because they stand out. In this particular area you can see they're very well protected and there's no predators. So they've built up in numbers, and as I said, about 120 on Bruny Island now.
So these tame, conspicuous wallabies thrive here, thanks to Bruny's extreme isolation. The coast of Bruny is wonderfully varied. In the south, it juts into the wild Southern Ocean. And people come here to experience a taste of the wild sub-Antarctic. Friars Rocks, at the southern tip of Bruny, are so remote they serve as a safe haul-out for Australian fur seals. Just a few kilometres from wave-battered headlands, sheltered coves lead to beaches that look more like the Caribbean. And when the tide drops, these beaches are invaded by armies of soldier crabs. Each crab filters the soft sand through complex mouthparts to separate any edible particles. It takes only a few seconds to process each mouthful, so thousands of crabs working together can clean the whole beach. Then, as the tide turns, they disappear back into the sand to wait for the sea to wash in more food. Bruny's location, surrounded by a rich ocean, and its isolation also makes it the perfect place for two creatures of the open sea to make landfall. This is a popular spot for Tonya's nature tours. But to see the spectacle means returning after dark.
This is a joint little penguin and short-tailed shearwater or muttonbird rookery. So we're waiting for the birds to come in. Oh, there's one. It's starting to build up now. Just minute by minute, there's more in the sky. They're like big fruit bats wheeling through the sky. You can hear them crash landing behind us.
By day, the shearwaters have been feeding out over the ocean in unbelievable numbers. In the past, some reckon to have seen flocks of 100 million birds. But at this time of year, under cover of darkness, they return to land to clear out old burrows, find their old mates, and begin breeding. Bright lights disturb these vital activities, but the birds are less sensitive to red light, which means tourists here can still enjoy the nightly spectacle. But the real stars of these late-night shows are the little penguins. They too have been feeding offshore, but unlike the shearwaters, they face a laborious slog up the dunes to find their burrows. The penguin show will soon be over, but even the drive back provides plenty of entertainment. Many of Tasmania's more unusual marsupials are nocturnal, but the island is so rich that at night the roads are crawling with wildlife. An eastern quoll, a family of brush-tailed possums. Not surprisingly, many animals are killed on Tasmania's roads. Good news for scavengers like quolls. But the problem is that these are all marsupials and could be carrying babies in their pouches. That's where Ray Green comes in.
This little guy's mum was hit by a car on the road and he was in the pouch, still alive. Because what happens is, if these don't die when the car hits them, they die of starvation. This little guy is about 4 months old, and as you can see, he's quite happy and having a little drink. When we got this guy, he'd fit in your top pocket. He was absolutely tiny. You wouldn't think looking at them that they're extremely high-stress animals. It doesn't take much to upset them. And a wombat at this age, if he gets a fright, he'll just hold his breath and fall over dead. There we go.
Ray has rescued over 100 wombats. Because of health problems, a few have to remain in captivity. Quite a handful when fully grown.
This is Wongle. How you going, buddy? As you'll see, he's a bit of a case. Well, he's about to try and bite my leg off, aren't you? Ooh, you're bad. You're just going to try and bite me big time, aren't you? Eh? Come on. You're going to be a good boy, or you're going to be a turd? There we go. Oh. You're going to latch onto me and it's going to hurt, aren't you? Now, don't bite.
But most have been released back into the wilds. Wombats live all over Tasmania, from coastal dunes to high mountain moorland, where they munch their way through grasses, moss, roots and shrubs. Another marsupial mowing machine.
Hey, Joogie! How are you today? Hello. Hey, Joogie! Yeah.
Ray calls his sanctuary something wild. And it's not just here to care for sick and injured animals. Ray settled on this area because there's a very special animal living in the river here.
This is the Gondwanan River. We're extremely lucky as in this runs right through the centre of the sanctuary. In here we have a family of platypus in this part of the river. Every 300 metres or so in the Gondwanan River there's a big platypus, just there. How's that? And the reason the sanctuary is where it is because of these guys. And we've been lucky enough to be able to preserve this area for the platypus forever now, basically.
Ray's platypus family have become so used to him that, so long as he sits still, they'll come to within a few feet.
At any time of the year, you can pretty much come in here and see wild platypus on the top of the water. You'll see them rolling, swimming along and lay on their back and scratch their stomach, fluffing the fur up, and you can come in here every day of the week as we do and still never get sick of it. They're an amazing critter.
In many ways, the whole of Tasmania is a sanctuary. The last sanctuary for many creatures.
This is an eastern quoll, only found in Tasmania. They used to be found all up and down the coast of eastern Australia, but they're extinct there now. Within 10 years, they went from prolific to extinct. Basically, quick as you could blink, they could disappear.
Quolls were wiped out on the mainland very recently by introduced creatures like foxes and cats. For the quoll, Tasmania is like an ark, cast adrift from the mainland. And the wild waters of the Bass Straits have been protecting another extraordinary predator for even longer. Tasmanian devils became extinct on the mainland, probably around 500 years ago, but they continue to thrive in Tasmania. On the wind-swept northwest coast, they exist in large numbers. But if you want to see them, you'll need to spend the night with Jeff King. Jeff's family have been cattle farmers for many generations. But a few years ago, Jeff decided to turn his coastal pastures into a private nature reserve, where people come for close encounters with wild devils.
So about 10 years ago, I took the cattle off this property, and the pasture, or the ex-pasture, still supports a really large number of wallabies mostly, but wombats and bandicoots and other things. But it's become a real paradise for predators. It's always good to have a scan of the property before you go down, just in case there's some echidnas or anything like that wandering around. Oh, and there's an echidna straight ahead of me. See straight over there? Can you see him?
Jeff's observation site is right on the coast, and there are plenty of devils here. But they'll need some encouragement to show themselves after the sun has set. Jeff has picked up a Bennett's wallaby roadkill, which will now become gourmet dinner for the devils. A privileged glimpse of wild Tasmania for the waiting tourists.
So we watch the devils under a soft light that I hook up to a battery, and I don't know how many devils are worried by light, but a heck of a lot of them aren't, and I'm not really sure as to what the reasons are. And the other thing is we can hear them inside with a baby monitor that I put in the bushes, so we can hear them when we're inside, not only see them but hear them. So they've got a really strong bite. A devil this size would have the jaw strength of a 40-kilogram dog, you know, something 4 times its size. In an adult devil, or an older devil, often their head and their neck can be 20% of their body size. So we've basically got an eating machine.
But now devils are in deep trouble in their last stronghold. In 1995, a mysterious disease broke out. A contagious cancer, which quickly proved lethal.
It's really hard to know how it started. It certainly started over in the northeast of the state. A tumour forms, lesions on the roof of the mouth or on the side, that eventually just becomes impossible for them to eat. They just die of starvation. But I haven't seen it, and I hope I don't.
The northwest is still free of disease, but for how much longer? It has now spread over half the island, and in affected areas, up to 90% of the devils die. It seems that the cells of the tumour are themselves infective and passed from devil to devil as they feed together. So far, no cure exists, which is why Ray Green is setting up a quarantined breeding facility. But breeding devils in captivity has never been easy. The biggest problem they had to solve was working out when a female is receptive. Put devils together at the wrong time and the female will get badly bitten.
At all.
But Ray can now tell to the exact day. And the female in this pen is not ready.
Yeah.
She has to be removed before the male injures her.
I reckon he's going to be cranky too. He's storing a heap of tucker in there, so he's be pretty cranky, I reckon. Whoa, he's cranky, all right. Which one you got? That's her, isn't it? Yep. Too easy. That's her, yep, that's her. And you'll see they've already started to fight a little bit. Hang on, Sean, tip him over. She's very, very docile.
Very sleepy. A little noise.
I'll just show you something. See, she's just got, if you look at her, see, she's got a little tiny cut on the top lip. That's from one day being together when they're not ready to breed. You can imagine, so that's basically 8 hours before she's ready. What people do, they leave them together for a month and she'll end up with horrific injuries. Luckily we've caught her in time. That'll heal up and she won't have a mark on her.
Ray's devils now breed very successfully in captivity, and the young are reared in natural enclosures. Devils are not just icons of Tasmania. They are the largest surviving marsupial carnivore, worth every effort to preserve. History shows that it's quite easy for such creatures to be driven to extinction. Once, there was an even larger carnivore in Tasmania. Like devils, Tasmanian tigers, or thylacines, became extinct on the mainland, but thrived in Tasmania's wilderness. But when European farmers came here, they saw such a large predator as a threat to livestock. Cole Bailey has looked at the history of the thylacine in great detail and concluded that the threat was deliberately exaggerated.
A politician on the East Coast back in the 1880s, he said that they were killing 50,000 sheep a year on the East Coast runs. Now we find out there's only over 40,000 sheep there. So I mean, he was a politician, of course, you know what politicians are like. So that's the sort of thing we're up against.
But tigers did eat sheep, so the Tasmanian government put a bounty on the tiger's head, which encouraged mass slaughter.
The Pearce family at Derwent Bridge caught something like 60 to 70 tigers alone.
Today at Derwent Bridge, woodcarver Greg Duncan has created this memorial to the numbers of tigers killed in just this one area. By the first decade of the 20th century, tigers were rare. Even so, Beaumaris Zoo in Hobart got hold of several thylacines in this period. This is the last one, supposedly called Benjamin, though no one's actually sure. But what is certain is that Benjamin died in September 1936, the last of his kind. At least, that's the official story.
Well, about 40 years ago, I did a lot of canoeing. And early one morning in the summer of 1967, on the far shore, about 400 metres away, I seen some sort of animal that drew my attention. And it was like nothing I'd ever seen before. It was a strange, greyhound, almost like a greyhound dog, but the way it moved and the shape of its general shape of its body was something unusual. So I paddled over the spot, and along the water's edge were these wonderful footprints. I'd never seen anything like it since, but because I was in the canoe, I never took my camera, so I had to virtually leave these beautiful footprints, wonderful they were, and I had to leave them behind. Oh, I wish I'd had that camera.
In fact, it's now thought that thylacines did probably hang on until as late as the 1960s. But Col is one of a number of people who believe that Tasmanian tigers are still out there, somewhere in these vast tracts of remote wilderness. Col is so convinced that he's already working out how to save the species.
What we have to do is get a breeding pair for a start. One breeding pair would start it off, and we've got to have a semi-captive breeding program. Now, Bruny Island off the east coast is the logical place for this. It's a self-contained island, there's plenty of wildlife there. It would suit the tiger down to the ground if you fenced half the island off and let him roam.
Bruny Island, an isolated spot off Tasmania's east coast, has already been used like this. It's now a national park and a sanctuary for several creatures. Cape Barren geese live on the windswept islands of the Bass Straits and around South Australia, but were once hunted for food almost to the point of extinction. They've never occurred naturally on Bruny Island, but in 1968, Tasmanian wildlife officials introduced a population here, as insurance against unseen events in the natural populations. And with no predators, they've thrived here. In addition, their constant grazing helps to keep the runway in good shape. They're aided in their runway maintenance by forester kangaroos that have also been introduced to the good life here. But these creatures won't look so complacent if Col ever finds his tigers. Bruny Island is uninhabited these days, but in the past it was farmed. There was even a cement factory here. And before that, its isolation made it seem perfect as a penal settlement for the very worst offenders. The trouble was, they kept building canoes and rafts from the local trees and escaping. So the convict settlement was moved to a more secure location, Port Arthur. This was the destination for Britain's hardest and most unrepentant prisoners, including those that continued in their criminal ways in penal settlements on mainland Australia. Today, it's Tasmania's top tourist destination. But many visitors might question how this prison could contain the hardest criminals. After all, Port Arthur is not an island. It's surrounded on three sides by shark-infested waters, or at least that's what the inmates were told. But it's connected to the mainland by the narrow isthmus of Eagle Hawk Neck. But here, a line of ferocious, ever-hungry dogs was staked out, on chains just long enough that there was no room for a convict to squeeze between them. Even so, a few convicts managed to escape from some of these isolated penal colonies, only to find themselves lost in a vast forested wilderness. In those days, they would have found themselves in forests of immense trees. It's still possible to find such giants, and Craig Williams knows exactly where to look, though it's easy to get distracted in these rich landscapes.
Here we have a little echidna. This fella's probably about half to what they can grow to in size. These can live up to about 70 years of age, which is quite amazing. They've been studied by NASA for years and years and years because NASA believe that the echidna holds the key to suspended animation. They can drop their body temperature from 34 degrees Celsius down to about 13 degrees in about half an hour and just sort of be suspended in that state. And often the female will actually give birth to the baby while she's actually in that state. So it's a pretty good way to have a family. Not much pain, I wouldn't think. Lovely little creature.
On with the mission.
These particular species of trees here are white gums. The ones in this area here are the tallest white gum trees in existence, known to mankind. The biggest one here is in excess of 91.3 metres, which is about 270 feet. And it's approximately 300 years old, which means it's 100 years older than early European settlement itself.
But white gums are not the biggest trees in these forests.
Well, here we are. This tree here on my right-hand side is Eucalyptus regnan, also known as the mountain ash, which is the tallest flowering plant in the world. The tallest tree ever measured was one of these. It was 136 metres tall. They don't come much bigger than that. Pretty impressive trees.
Such huge trees were seen as Tasmania's greatest asset, as the colony moved beyond being just a penal settlement. In the past, the great trees were felled with axe and saw, a hard and dangerous life. A life commemorated by artist Greg Duncan. His plan is to carve Tasmania's history into a 100-metre-long wall of Huon pine, a project that will take him another 7 years to finish. Since logging is central to Tasmania's history, Greg began his ambitious project with a scene from the lives of the first timbermen. In the early days, logs had to be hauled out by horses or oxen. But as technology developed, the pace of logging increased. Today, Tasmania's ancient Gondwanan rainforests are still being logged. And every single Tasmanian has an opinion on this. No one here is neutral. Critics of logging point out that much of the wood from these unique forests, 3.5 million tonnes of it every year, is simply being reduced to wood chips and sent to Asia. Tasmania is the largest exporter of wood chips on the planet. Yet, Tasmania is also Australia's poorest state, and supporters of the timber industries claim that 10,000 jobs depend on logging old-growth forest, a figure hotly contended by the Green camp. Today, the forests are logged both by the state and by a large private company, which wants to expand its wood chip production. The state organisation, Forestry Tasmania, has a more complex remit.
We're in the Florentine Valley in a harvesting area of about 20 hectares. It's on land managed by Forestry Tasmania. It's a regrowth forest and most of the trees are 60 to 70 years old with a few remnant older trees. This area has been managed as a working forest since about the 1930s and 40s, harvested in the past using the old-time methods of felling by axe, and the regrowth forest is now being harvested again.
By making more use of such regrowth forest, Forestry Tasmania is slowly trying to reduce its felling of ancient forests. But many Australians want to see logging in old-growth forests stopped completely, 85% of them in a recent poll. These forests could be far more valuable standing than felled. As big as the profits are from timber and wood chips, little of it actually stays in Tasmania. So eco-tourism could be worth far more to local people. In fact, Forestry Tasmania is itself already involved in eco-tourism.
So of the 1.5 million hectares of land that Forestry Tasmania manages, a lot of that land is protected, and each year only about 1% is available for harvesting. So there are significant areas that are now being developed for commercial tourism.
One of those areas is Dismal Swamp, a place that's actually far from being dismal. It's a magnificent forest of large blackwood trees growing in a deep sinkhole. And Forestry Tasmania has provided an exhilarating way for the brave to get down to the swamp at the bottom. A maze of raised walkways lead through the tangled swamp forest to reveal sculptures inspired by forest life. Giant metal mantises hang from trees. Crayfish abound in these forests, but these metre-high sculptures are much easier to find than the real thing. Most crayfish live in streams or in swampy forests, building these tall chimneys of mud at the entrance to their burrows. But Tasmania also has a unique terrestrial crayfish, happy searching for food across the forest floor under cover of darkness. Before dawn, this little crayfish has to find its burrow again, at the bottom of which is a pool of rainwater. Time for a refreshing soak. Trees are not the only natural resource that Tasmania has to offer. In the late 1800s, gold was discovered at Mount Lyell. After that, silver and copper deposits were also found in these remote areas. To get these valuable resources out, a rack and pinion railway had to be built right through the heart of the southwestern wilderness. It connected a deep water port on the remote west coast to the mining district, centred on Queenstown. Mining was as difficult and dangerous as logging. So Queenstown is proud of its heritage. A series of statues and bronzes to commemorate this hard life stands in the town centre. Technology brought improvements to the miner's life, but it was never easy. Mining brought wealth to Queenstown, but it also brought destruction. The hills around town are still a moonscape, stripped of trees to feed the smelters and scoured for minerals. Today, Queenstown is a quiet spot, though mining continues. And new mines are still opening in the remote mountains. The latest, a gold mine in 1998. But Tasmania's greatest resource is undoubtedly its wilderness. This is what drew Gustav Weindorfer to Cradle Mountain at the start of the 20th century. But it wasn't just the freedom of a remote mountain fastness. Weindorfer was a botanist and was captivated by the plants of this green island. These giant pandani are found nowhere else but Tasmania. He collected many specimens for the Natural History Museum back in Vienna, and also recorded rainfall and weather conditions on the mountain for meteorologists in Hobart. But his real passion was for preserving as much of this wild landscape as possible. On his very first visit here, he declared, "This must be a national park for the people for all time. It is magnificent, and people must know about it and enjoy it." 10 years after he came here, Weindorfer got his wish, and Cradle Mountain was declared a national park, a place where everyone could come to appreciate Tasmania's wild heritage. Though it was not an easy place to get to for the first of Tasmania's eco-tourists, it was a long and uncomfortable trip along rough tracks. Nevertheless, each year saw more and more visitors to Waldheim, people coming to experience wild Tasmania. Gustav Weindorfer died in 1932 and was buried close to Waldheim, where he's still kept company by Tasmanian natives. Black currawongs, birds found only on this island. And they too have come to appreciate Weindorfer's vision of a national park. Today, Cradle Mountain caters to its thousands of visitors with restaurants and cafes, and, inevitably, to resourceful currawongs. Tasmania now draws people from a more crowded world to experience wild, and not so wild, nature, and to experience a very different kind of Australia. Tasmania's verdant landscape is a world away from the desert continent of Australia. Here, wilderness runs almost into the heart of its capital city. Today, more than 1/3 of all Tasmania's land is protected in national parks or private reserves. Weindorfer's dream has spread far beyond the remote wilderness of Cradle Mountain. Despite severe threats to this dream, of logging in the old-growth rainforests or of deadly epidemics killing Tasmanian devils, Tasmania remains a special place, a green gem tucked away at the bottom of the world.